Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you're enjoying the content, please drop us up, drop a like, and let us know your thoughts below in the comments. Also, please consider supporting our podcast via the link below. It really helps us out. Dr. Singh, welcome to the World XP podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on. I really appreciate your time, like we mentioned earlier, and at the date of recording, classes are starting soon, so it was very nice of you to carve out an hour or so to or however long it takes us to get this conversation in. For those listening, Dr. Singh is kind of studying a variety of things that I'm interested in, and so I decided to reach out, and here we are. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Eric. I really appreciate being on your podcast. As I was mentioning to you when we were making chit chat a little earlier, I'm not a consumer of podcasts. My kids are. I kind of missed that wave, but so this is actually my first experience with a podcast. But I'm willing to try anything new. And as you said, I'm a professor at the University of Mary Washington. I teach in the Department of Political Science and International Affairs. I've been here since 2004, so almost 20 years now teaching. Before that, I was actually a student at University of Mary Washington. Back then, Mary Washington College. So right. I think you and I have the same degree, basically. Then,
yeah.
And I teach courses on international politics and Middle East politics, as well as environmental politics. So I'm kind of scattered thin. You know, I have some colleagues who are very, very focused in their careers and have written 4 or 5 books on, you know, just like my buddy Steve Farnsworth on media and politics and stuff like that. I'm kind of more, you know, I may not have the attention span that some of my colleagues have. I get interested in things, I pursue them for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And then kind of, I find, especially in middle age now, I kind of look over there and say, but that's really interesting. I want to know about that. And I do a deep dive into that. So you could say I'm kind of the department's generalist in some ways.
Yeah.
a dangerous amount of knowledge on just a wide variety of topics.
Yeah, that's what I say as well. I know just enough to get myself into trouble in a variety of ways.
Exactly.
And Dr. Farnsworth, actually, for those listening, was on the show, I think episode 50 something, a little ways back. And yeah, I looked at his profile or his website. He's been on the same media and the presidency the entire time. And then Dr. Davidson, who's also in your department, I actually had him as a professor as well. So the original reason why I wanted to talk to you, as I stated in the email, was the kind of maybe we'll say recent history of the Middle East, because as the last 20 or so years, the U.S. has been involved in the Middle East in a variety of, we'll say, maybe not so great ways, and it seems to me that from an American perspective, we don't really understand the culture or what is going on a grassroots level. I've spoken with several people who were deployed, and they have one set of view, but I wanted to really understand from, I guess, basically from the formation of Israel, kind of from that time frame, how things ended up where they are, because right, Russia invaded in Afghanistan, or Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the 80s, and then we funded bin Laden, and then that whole the whole thing starts to get very convoluted and very confusing. And so this was another thing that I read an article, and I was like, oh, I want to talk to somebody about this, and so I reached out, and here we are. So I don't if you can give a general sort of, I don't know, synopsis maybe, or summary, and then we can maybe deep dive in a few areas.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, just to kind of set the broader context, and then we can start at 80,000 feet, and then if you're more interested in one thing, we can kind of go there or not. But you know, if you went back and looked, say, 100 years ago, the United States was not very involved in the Middle East, right? We weren't a great imperial power like the British and the French and the Germans wanted to be, and the Italians and things like those were the great colonial powers. So if in the late 19th century, early 20th century, if you looked at a map of what we today call the modern Middle East, you would see French colonies, British, Italian, all of this, you know, but you wouldn't really see an American presence, except for in some cultural instances. For example, American missionaries would go to the Middle East, and they would set up colleges, you know, learning centers, things like that, which often were quite good. and still exist in some forms there, like the American University in Beirut, the
Mm-hmm.
American University in Cairo. These are well-known organizations that really go back to that time period. But politically and economically, we were not very enmeshed in the Middle East. And generally, across the Middle East, if you go back to the period of, say, World War I, when Woodrow Wilson was the president of the United States, if Arabs and Kurds and Middle Easterners had any particular opinion of the United States, is usually a favorable opinion, because we did not have that colonial baggage in the region, right?
Right.
They had plenty of reasons to be angry at the British and the French and all these, right? You know, who were
Yeah, of course.
dominating their societies. But the Americans had kind of been, not that involved, as I said. But also, if you think of Woodrow Wilson and Wilsonian democracy, what that meant back in World War I and at the end of World War I, and some of you who are listening may remember from high school the Wilson's famous 14-point speech towards the end of World War I, where he said, you know, the problems that led us into this great war are the absence of democracy and the absence of freedom, and all these different nations in the world are aspiring to their own sovereignty and things like that. And that's, you know, it was because those freedoms, those rights were not recognized by the great powers. We ended up in a war and on all of this. So Woodrow Wilson was actually seen throughout much of the region as a bit of a liberator, as a sympathetic figure. So you know, there is actually polling from that time. It's not scientific polling, but there would be study missions and things like that after World War I that found that in a place like Palestine, where Palestinians and Israelis now live, you know, that most of the people there had very positive image of the United States. But you know, time passed, and to kind of rush through a lot of history here, after World War II in particular, the British Empire was teetering on the verge of collapse, right? Britain won the war as part of that alliance with the Americans and the Soviets and whatnot that defeated Hitler, but Britain was absolutely bankrupt and could no longer afford to keep its empire. India got its independence in the late 1940s. The British were pulling out of Palestine, pulling out of Iraq, all of these kinds of places, the French and whatnot. And so that's when, as the Cold War was starting up, and you saw that there was going to be a global tension between these two forces, between the Soviet-dominated sphere and the American-dominated sphere, that's where there was a lot of fear in Western capitals that as the British and the colonial powers who are bankrupt start pulling out of the Persian Gulf, pulling out of Palestine, pulling out of these areas, there could be a power vacuum, right? And who's going to fill that power vacuum? Well, the fear was, of course, that the Soviets would, right? With their allies, they would make inroads into this very strategic area of the world. So it's really from the late 40s and 1950s, especially, where the U.S. starts moving into the region. And the British and our other allies start pulling out of the region. Of course, this is a global phenomenon, right? Because the Cold War was a global conflict. So it's not just the Middle East, it's also Southeast Asia, right? Vietnam, Cambodia, places like that. It's also parts of Central America, parts of Africa and all of that, where, you know, the French were the colonial power in Southeast Asia. As they pulled out in the 1950s, the United States filled in, and we ended up with the Vietnam War and these kinds of conflicts. So if you look at it from, as I said, 80,000 feet, what was happening were the old colonial powers were starting to lose influence, and for their own economic and political reasons, having to retract from their old colonial possessions. And the fear in Washington, D.C., and the State Department and the Defense Department and so forth was that these power vacuums would be filled by our rivals. So we started moving in. And of course, what made the Middle East so important in this dynamic is that, unlike some other areas of the world, there's oil, right? There are strategic resources that cannot be ignored, and that the West and the whole world was dependent upon. And that's actually one of the reasons why the British originally went into the Persian Gulf,
Hmm.
because the British, right before World War One, made the shift from coal burning vessels to oil burning vessels. And Britain had a lot of coal, which is why we say shipping coals to Newcastle. You know, we have these kinds of
Yeah,
expressions, but it didn't have oil, especially back then before the North Sea became exploited for oil. So they looked at around the globe and they said, where is the oil? Well, the oil is in the Persian Gulf, Persia back then being Iran, right? That
right,
was the name of Iran. And so actually today, BP, British Petroleum, the modern, multinational corporation, British Petroleum, its origins are in that period in the very early part of the 20th century. It was known as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And it was an oil company started by the British to make sure that they had control over Persian, which is now Iranian, oil, because they knew they were in a rivalry with the Germans and the other great powers, which ultimately led to World War One. And Britain, being an island nation, uh, its defense, its security has always depended upon its navy, right? Its
right.
navy had to be superior to the German navy, to the Russian navy, to the French navy, whatever. And to maintain that superiority, they had to have secure oil for their navy. And so that really kind of brought them in. And of course, that same logic attained after the British pulled out. From kind of a geostrategic logic, the Americans in no way were going to leave Saudi Arabia and Iran and Kuwait and all these unattended during the Cold War. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense from a strategic point of
Uh-huh.
like natural resource point of view. So there's two things that I think I want to
Sure.
maybe dive into a little bit more. The first is that um so as these big power, great powers will say, it looking at them from a strategic point of view, from the people on the ground that are living there, and how the countries were divided up after, say, the Ottoman Empire split up, and it doesn't seem like the territories or countries were divided up, kind of similar to Africa, where the lines were just kind of drawn arbitrarily by people in the West.
Right.
So I want to touch on that, and then I also want to touch on the how we ended up having different relations with the different groups, like the Saudis. Generally, I feel like the U.S. has a decent relationship with vice some of the instead of Iran or something like that. And so how we ended up in these, and I know for Iran we've got the whole Iran Contra thing and
Yeah.
all that history that went into it. So those are kind of the two topics that I want to dive into because for me, the 50s to say the beginning of like the Iraq War to 9/11 are very intriguing to me because you see the rise of the military industrial complex and then the proxy wars starting
Right.
where it's very odd because it becomes less pre World War II, things seem to be a little bit more clear. It's like, okay, this country fights this country, and that one wins, and there's the treaty. And then after that, it was, we'll give this group over here some weapons so they can mess with our enemies, and then it becomes very shady and
Right.
murky, if that makes sense. So those are kind of the two areas that I am hoping to learn more about.
Oh, yeah, that's a lot. I teach, whole semesters on
Yeah,
exact
yeah.
kinds of questions that you're asking.
Of
But
course, of course.
right. Yeah, I appreciate completely what you're saying. And they're very actually informed questions because what you are doing, which is useful, is you are saying that the Middle East has gone through stages of development and stages of evolution, right? And keeping in mind that we're really only talking about 100 years
Right.
of history here, or maybe a little bit more, right? 125 or so years. So yeah, it's been a very fluid, very dynamic kind of situation. I think one thing that, I think your first question, you were talking about how the borders were drawn, right? Because so many of our contemporary and as well as long lasting tensions in the Middle East have been
Hmm.
about borders, right?
Yeah.
Who owns what territory, what group.
Or even just from the people that are already living there, right? So they've had to deal with the British going in and then
Right.
the US going in and how they are lumped together by some other power, even though, right,
Right.
the Sunnis don't get along with the Shiites, but somehow they ended up in Iraq all in the same country
Right.
because of that sort of dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. I mean, one thing that is important to keep in mind is, I just described how the colonial powers, the great powers, Britain, France, others, Italy, and so forth, withdrew from the region ultimately, right? Especially after World War II. But that was, of course, not a clear-cut process, right? It happened kind of in stages. And after World War I, given the rise of Wilsonian democracy, Wilsonian ideals, these kind of liberal principles that people who form a nation should have their own sovereign state and things like that. Woodrow Wilson won the Nobel Peace Prize for those ideas. He was tremendously popular around the world. So the British and the French and the other great powers, they all had to deal with that popular pressure that was making naked imperialism kind of uncool anymore, right? In some ways. You didn't want to be seen as being too imperialist. So what you would try to do then, given that they still had interests, like I just talked about, oil and Suez Canal and things like that, what they tried to do was to exert power over parts of the Middle East somewhat indirectly, right? To create an image that these natives of the Middle East had sovereignty, had independence, but in reality did not, right? So after World War I, there were some international peace conferences that were called and formed, and all the potentates and the dignitaries came together and spent months figuring out what's going to happen to this part of the world, all of this. And they felt these two tensions, right? One tension was that we can't be naked imperialists. That's uncool. At the same time, we have interests and we're not going to give up our interests. So what you ended up seeing is that, especially, I'll just kind of focus on one part of the Middle East, which is that area of today's Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, kind of that eastern area of the Arab world. The British and the French just drew national boundaries, right? And they said, in the most cases, they said, okay, this is going to be an independent or a quasi-independent state, but we're really going to rule over it, right? We're going to be in charge of especially the foreign policy of these states, and we're actually going to choose who the presidents are going to be, or the kings, or whatever the case may be, and they rule with our approval and all of that. And this whole system was overseen by the brand new League of Nations, right? The League of Nations did this around the world. Again, it was a global phenomenon. There are islands out in the Pacific Ocean, some of these Micronesian, Polynesian, whatever kind of islands that became a part of France, became a part of Britain, and all of this. So it was a global scheme, but we're talking about the Middle East here. So, for example, the French ended up with what is today Syria and Lebanon. That was called, under the League of Nations rule, it was called the French Mandate for Syria, right? And the French had their own interests. They had been active in that area for some time. They had cultural ties, especially with the Christian groups there, many of whom were Catholic, like the majority of French. And so they started drawing the borders of Syria. Syria, under the Ottoman Empire, didn't have national borders, right? If you lived in the Ottoman Empire, you could travel from one end of it to the other. You didn't need a passport or a visa or anything like that. So you could, if you lived in Baghdad, you could do business with your cousin in Damascus. Maybe you were, I don't know, moving perfume or jewelry or spices or something like that around. And you were all under the Ottoman Empire. There were no barriers to travel or transport or anything like that. Well, these barriers start being put in place when these start becoming states, independent states. But the French are still in control of that territory. And because they favor certain groups, which gets to your second question, they favor certain groups over other groups. They start making these boundaries in ways that reflect that favoritism. For example, there was no state of Lebanon prior to the 1920s. Lebanon, what we think of today as Lebanon, was all part of the greater Syria region of the Ottoman Empire, right? But the mountainous area of what is today Lebanon had a number of minorities, especially different Christian groups that the French had a cultural affinity towards and had a close alliance with. Often Catholics or Maronite Catholics, other types of groups. And they were worried that these friends of theirs, you could kind of call them, were going to be dominated by a Muslim majority in Syria, and wouldn't have all the privileges that the French thought that they would be due. So they carved a new Lebanese state out of Syria. And ever since that time, even today, the Syrian regime, if you listen to its rhetoric, they still consider Lebanon a part of Syria. From their nationalist perspective, the French had no right to carve out. It's as if, someone came to the United States and said New England is a separate part, right? A separate country. And it's like, we may decide that amongst ourselves, but no foreigner can decide that, right?
Right.
And so that's one of the built-in kind of tensions there. And within that Lebanese state in the 1920s, the new Lebanese state that eventually emerged from that process, the Christians were an early majority. So they would have political ascendancy, primacy within that Lebanese state. It's very revealing that Lebanon has not had a national census, and you're putting me on the spot here, but I think it's since the 1920s or 1930s.
I think you put yourself on the spot.
Yeah. I mean, because I have lecture notes when I talk about this, which has the date, right? But they have not had a national census. It's an independent nation now, right? Has not had a national census since the 20s or 30s. Why is that the case? Well, when the French created Lebanon, they were creating a state in which they engineered a Christian majority, right? So that their Christian allies would be dominant in that state, politically dominant. Well, the demographics have changed, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Muslim families, Sunni and Shiite, tend to have more children than Christian families. And many of the Christian members of the community have emigrated to France, to Canada, to the United States, what have you, right? So everybody in Lebanon knows that if there were an honest census done today or in any time in the last 50 years, Muslims would be in a clear majority. Muslims of different sects and types and all of that. However, that would upset the political balance because in the Lebanese constitution, which was really what the French had in mind, the Christians are given the presidency. In fact, the Lebanese constitution is fascinating because according to the Lebanese constitution, the president must be a Maronite Christian and the prime minister must be a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of the Parliament must be a Shiite Muslim, right?
Very interesting.
Yeah, so that's the old system that was set up, right? With the president being the Christian with the paramount power, right?
Yeah.
But now we know the demographics have changed. And the Shiites have been arguing for generations now, we're the biggest group here. We should be the ones with most of the political power, right? Or at least have a chance towards it. And the Sunnis make a similar case. And that's one of the reasons why Lebanon has been so unstable, chronically unstable, because it has a kind of neo-colonial institutional framework placed over a society that does not reflect the realities of 1920s and 1930s and all of that. It's got a built-in dissatisfaction with the status quo. And of course, it flares up. It flares up violently quite often. And the Lebanese Civil War devastated the country in the 1970s and 80s until the early 1990s. And it's still a powder keg, as we see almost every week in the news. Yeah. So that's an example of colonial powers messing around with lines. And we haven't even talked about Palestinians and Israelis and all that, but messing around with lines where there weren't lines before, and creating kind of artificial political entities that people in the modern age are now stuck with, having to live with and trying to reform in some cases.
Yeah. So maybe this is a naive sort of question, but if everybody in Lebanon agrees that they shouldn't be living in that way, I guess what I don't understand, or what I do understand based on how things happened, what I don't understand is why. So I tend to be more like kind of libertarian in
Uh-huh.
view. And if you've got a village that just wants to live how they want to live, and then you've got another group that is trying to, I I don't, let me see if I can frame this question the way that to ask what I mean to ask. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, all right, so Lebanon is royally screwed, right? Because they've got the tension with Syria because the French just took it away. And then also, based on the way that the Constitution is written, now they've got this power struggle between Sunni, Shiite, and to I guess a lesser extent now the Christians. And so at what point are you are the people of Lebanon saying, okay, Sunnis can live over here and Shiites can live over here and we'll do our own thing. That's
Right.
the thing that I don't that's I really don't understand that about the Middle East
Yeah.
because it seems in almost every country there's a war or conflict between the two major sects of
Right.
Islam. And I'm like,
Mhm.
why you guys don't like each other? That's okay. Just you go there and you go there and it's fine. And I understand that there's definitely historical ties to some parts and a lot of them are mixed. And it's like, okay, well, we want this part because we had some tie to some historical thing over here and we had this one, but we also have this one. And so it mixes and it creates all the things. But I can you explain or expand on that?
Oh, yeah. Sure, you're asking a great question, right? Which is basically why can't everybody just get along, right?
Well,
And do their own
yeah,
thing, right? And
yeah,
live and let live and all of that. Just to give you some more background on this, if you're a libertarian or if you have that kind of perspective, you probably would have been happiest with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a multinational empire, right? It
right.
existed for hundreds of years, from the 15th century up until the end of World War One. And it waxed and waned. Its borders changed over time, depending on wars and who was the more powerful sultan and things like that. But it spanned from southeastern Europe all the way across the Mediterranean, across North Africa, down into Arabia. It was a significant entity.
Yeah.
And one of the causes, I think, a major cause of stability of this empire that spans so many different religious sects, ethnic sects, linguistic sects, all of these things, was that the Ottomans had a system, and it's referred to as the millet system, that essentially said each community runs its own affairs. All right.
Mm,
So if you're a Kurdish community living in a Kurdish village in the mountains, um, as long as you are being loyal to the Ottoman Sultan and maybe paying the taxes or whatever your job as a citizen of the Ottoman Empire are, you run your own affairs. You have your own religious leaders. If you're Jewish, you have the rabbi. If you're Christian, you have the priest. If whatever, you do this. If you're Sunni, you have the sheikh of the or the imam of the mosque in your village and things like that. And they decide, all the things that religion decides: who can marry whom, what's the inheritance, where are the rules of inheritance, how can you get a divorce, can you get a divorce, all of these things that really occupy our daily lives, right? We don't spend much time thinking about high politics. We worry about these daily kind of quotidian affairs. The Ottoman system, the genius of the Ottoman system was to leave those things to the communities themselves, right? So that's why when Europe was really crushing Jews in the Inquisition, and the 15th century and all of this in Spain and stuff like that, so many Jews ran to the Ottoman Empire,
mm,
to places like Baghdad, to Beirut, to Damascus, to Aleppo, to Jerusalem, and all of this, because while they could never aspire to be, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire or something like that, they could live in peace in the Ottoman Empire and be in charge of their own affairs. So, in comparison to the European history of tolerance of minorities, the Ottoman Empire had a pretty good record on what we
Yeah.
would today call human rights and religious tolerance. Now, I don't, I'm glossing over a lot of history here. There were some Ottoman sultans who were less tolerant and some who were more tolerant and so forth. But what made this multinational community, society work was that basically it was founded on principles of tolerance, and that comes really from actually, I'm not a Muslim, but from a pretty basic teaching of the Quran. In Islam, all the people of the monotheisms of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are considered what's called in Arabic the people of the book, the one
Hmm.
book, meaning they're all of a family. They all worship the same God. The Arabic word Allah just means the only God, the one and only God.
Right.
So it's the same as when a Christian says God, God be praised or praise God or thank God or something. It's the exact same thing they say in Arabic, just with a different language or in Hebrew or so. So there's kind of a, if it is implemented and understood, there is kind of a built-in tolerance within Islam uh, to coexisting with Jews and Christians, right? The Prophet Muhammad, who lived in the seventh century, died in 632. In Islam, he is seen as the last prophet of a series of prophets who revealed the truth about God, and that series of prophets includes Moses, Jesus, and the same patriarchs and whatnot that the Christians and Jews and all those believe. So Islam incorporates, there's you can read in the Quran, the holy book of Islam. You can read about Mary and Jesus and all that. They're all part of the
Yeah.
package, right? Basically, the innovation of Islam, if you want to look at it that way, is that they add one more prophet, Muhammad, in the seventh century, who gives the final revelation of what is God and what is Islam and all that. And there are no more prophets after that. They call him the seal, which is why I keep doing this
Yeah.
gesture.
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay, after him, no more prophets, but they accept all the earlier prophets, right? So there's a built-in kind of tolerance for that. And by and large, with notable exceptions, the Ottomans acted upon that tolerance, right? Now the Europeans brought in their own baggage. As I said, anti-Semitism was quite strong in Europe, and
Hmm.
French, German, even British and whatnot society, right? And also nationalism is a really Western ideology, right? As we talked about with Woodrow Wilson,
Right.
Woodrow Wilson said the cause of World War I, if you go back to the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand in 1914 by a Serbian nationalist, who wanted an independent Serbian nation and all that. Woodrow Wilson said the problem, what caused World War I, was that these nations did not have their own self-determination, right? So when that ideology gets imported into the Middle East, that is like the death knell for a multi-ethnic, multinational empire like the Ottoman Empire, because these different nations, the Kurds, the Arabs, the Serbians, the Croats, all these, the Turks, what have you, are starting to say, wait a minute, the Jews are starting to say, wait a minute, we are a nation, and so we should have our own state. And that's a threat to the integrity of the Ottoman Empire on an ideological level, right? And so
Yes. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
disintegration of the Ottoman Empire is in part the story of the introduction of these ideologies and their spread within the empire among intellectuals, and many of whom Arab intellectuals, Turkish intellectuals who studied in the West, studied in Paris, studied in London, and were imbued with these kinds of ideas. Um, so that's my long-winded kind of explanation for why can't these communities kind of live their own affairs independently of each other and just tolerate each other. They actually had a pretty good record of doing that under the
Yeah.
Ottomans, and later things kind of got messed up. And then you were talking about some later events, I forget exactly what you're saying, but just kind of updating all of that.
Yeah, it was how we ended up from where we were. So I think your explanation started the answer to the second part of the question, which was how did we end up having like good relationships with, say, the Saudis and not so good with Iran? Because from somebody just if you just look at it, if
Yeah.
you say today, okay, the U.S. has a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, but not Iran, even though they're right next to each other and they have the same. It's like that make like why? It seems like random, like you flip a coin.
Yeah. It's a great question.
Um,
Well, let's start with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a different history from most of its neighbors, which is an important thing to keep in mind. Most of its neighbors were part of the Ottoman Empire. Saudi Arabia was never part of the Ottoman Empire, so it has an independent history. Saudi Arabia, as a
does that
modern,
go all the way down to the rest of the peninsula, like Kuwait and
largely, yeah, Kuwait
UAE?
was part of the Ottoman Empire. If you look, just kind of make a mental map of the Arabian Peninsula, right?
Right.
Um, the Ottomans were most interested in those areas that had resources that were important to them, right? Like any empire.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think of like where the agricultural resources, the fertile land and things like that are, they're in the valleys, like the Jordan Valley and
Right.
Jordan and West Bank of Palestine. They're in Syria, which is very fertile.
Mm-hmm.
Iraq is very fertile with the Tigris and Euphrates. Of course, as an Islamic empire, also the Ottoman Empire was interested in Mecca and Medina, the holy,
Of
because
course.
it had great status and prestige and things like that. So if you look at that Arabian Peninsula, the Ottomans were most interested in kind of the wings of the peninsula. Up in the north, they extended their influence through Syria and Iraq, coming down to Kuwait, to the north part of the Persian Gulf, and in the west, through Jordan, through what is today Palestine and Israel, parts of Egypt, depending on the period, and then down towards Mecca and Medina.
Right.
So along the coasts, right? They were interested in those areas, and also they were most able to extend their military power in those areas. You look at what is today Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, let's say go back to the 19th century, it's desert.
Yeah.
Not, before oil, who cares, right?
Yeah.
It's a classic pattern that empires are not very good or very interested in extending their power over desert or over really mountainous areas, usually, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
there's not much there and it's hard to control them. You'd have to expend a lot of troops. And what do sand dunes is what you get, right? So the Ottomans didn't really bother with the interior of the Arabian Peninsula much, which meant that um, the Arabian Peninsula had a different political history. It was a tribal political history by and large, and it's kind of a long story. But what happened going back to the 18th century is there was a notable kind of militaristic family, a clan there called the Saud family. Al Saud is their name.
Mm-hmm.
And they had expansionist and political ambitions, and they made an alliance with a fundamentalist religious group led by a guy whose last name was Al Wahhab, the Wahhabis, they were called, and they were preaching a very austere form of Islam. Their argument was that Islam, over the centuries since the Prophet, had become polluted with innovations and all these bad ideas and non-Islamic ideas. So they were preaching we need a complete revival of Islam, the original Islam, and we're not going to tolerate anything else. And so these political leaders and military leaders, the Saud family, made an alliance with this religious movement. And that is the origin of the contemporary Saudi state. Because when you bring political and military power together with religious legitimacy and religious kind of energy,
Yeah.
that's a powerful combination,
Yeah.
right? It legitimates, in the eyes of God, it legitimates the political authority, right? So
Yes.
they seized power in the central part of that peninsula, and they established in the early part of the 20th century the modern state of Saudi Arabia. It is literally named after that ruling family, and that's why that ruling family has always allowed their clerics, their religious establishment, to pursue these, what we in the West usually see as very austere, fundamentalist religious doctrines and behaviors and kind of strictures and so forth, right? This, until what was it, like 4 years ago, women couldn't drive in Saudi Arabia, right? And
Right.
still have public beheadings and executions and things like that. That's because that was part of the bargain, right? The religious establishment says, yes, the political establishment is legitimate. And the political establishment in Saudi Arabia said, yes, these religious leaders are in charge of our cultural and religious affairs. They dictate how we're going to live, right? And that's been a
Mm.
very formidable combination, which helps to understand today why the Saudi, this monarchy in the 21st century is still pretty stable, right? Now, your question was like, how did the United States end up allied with this monarchy?
Yeah.
Well, because go back to in part the geography of the region. If the Ottomans weren't that interested in this blank interior of the region, these sand dunes and steppes and all of this that just had camels and sheep and stuff like that, almost no water, right? Then the European powers weren't that interested in it either,
Oh,
right?
so was it just a I'll say not chance, but just it happened to be that way that we were like, oh, here's some land that nobody else wants, and we want a footprint here, so we'll talk with them.
Talking
Was
about
it?
the Americans here?
Yeah.
No, no, no. Here's the interesting
Okay.
story. Okay. So imagine now the Saudi state has consolidated itself, declared its independence as a modern nation state in the 1920s. All right.
Okay.
Now, any Saudi king is responsible for the development of the country, right? What's the big problem that Saudi Arabia has if you're trying to modernize or develop to the extent that they wanted to? They don't have enough water, right? You can't do agriculture, you can't build big cities, you have to have water, right? So the Saudis were clever enough to know you don't go talking to the British and the French about finding more water, because you invite the British in, they don't leave, right? That's a history, or the French. These are imperial powers. So they go and they talk to the Americans, to the American engineers, and this is the 1920s, 1930s, and they say, the king says, we need some of your engineers to come here and do a survey of Saudi Arabia. And what we want you to do is find water sources, drill for wells and aquifers and things like that, because we can't do anything with this country. We can't build it up until we have water. So they brought in American engineers and scientists who did whatever the technology of the age was. They flew around in biplanes, surveyed the country. They went through, with the headdresses and the camels. They went on, caravans through the desert, did all their scientific surveys, and they reported back to the king and said, "Sir, we have some bad news, Your Majesty. We don't find a lot of water. There's just not a lot of water here. However, we keep stumbling into oil everywhere, the sticky, gluey, stuff, right? Everywhere we put in a test well or something, we're hitting this oil." The Saudi king is deeply disappointed. He has no use for oil. He doesn't have any factories. He barely, maybe he has one car, that he's driving. This is
Yeah.
1920s or something like that. So the American engineers are like, oil is actually pretty useful here, right?
Yeah.
It's a global commodity. It's a strategic commodity, and if you play your cards well, you can get pretty rich off of this stuff. And so that is the genesis story behind the alliance between the United States and Saudi Arabia, because then American oil executives and engineers and all this started coming into Saudi Arabia and developed the oil industry. The Saudis didn't have the know-how, right? They were a nomadic and agricultural society. They didn't have engineers and all of that. And what was formed out of that is a huge corporation that still exists. It's called Aramco, the Arab American Oil Company,
Yeah.
right? Enormous, and it's still what pumps out the oil in Saudi Arabia and refines it and all of this. So that's how that alliance began. And actually, late in World War II, I forget the exact year. You can go Google it. You can see pictures of Franklin Delano Roosevelt on a boat meeting with the Saudi king. He realized this is a strategic. He met with him in person. This is a strategic alliance that we want
Yeah.
to work on, especially with the Cold War starting up. And America, of course, with the post-war boom, we needed oil. We were actually oil independent up until the 1950s, but then we started needing more and more oil from the Middle East and all that. And so one thing led to another, and so we ultimately became the guarantors of Saudi security, national security during the Cold War and afterwards. And which gets to your question, talking about the Gulf War, 1991. Saddam Hussein takes over Kuwait and could have kept rolling into Saudi Arabia. Who protects Saudi Arabia? It was the American bases. We rushed 150,000 troops there almost overnight. It was the greatest logistical feat in history, really.
Yeah.
In many ways. That was the nature of our deal with the Saudis. They keep oil at reasonable prices. It's been a rocky road, but
Yeah.
we ensure their security. And as the British pulled out of the Gulf, out of Kuwait, out of Bahrain, out of the UAE, out of Qatar, out of Oman, these areas, we moved in. Right, our Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. The U.S.
Hmm.
Fifth Fleet, which is in charge of security in the Persian Gulf, Iran, Iraq, all of that, is based in Bahrain. That is like a check to the nation of Bahrain that no one's going to mess with your independence, because these tiny microstates cannot defend themselves. They're oil rich, but there's no way Qatar can defend itself or Kuwait can defend itself from bigger powers like Iraq or Iran or so if they want to take them over. They need that external patron to defend them.
Yeah. All that makes total sense.
Mhm.
Okay, let's switch. We'll switch topics here because if I
All
think
right.
if we keep going Middle East, we'll be here until tomorrow. Um, so the other thing that you're working on now is some environmental work based in locally to Fredericksburg and along the Potomac. And I read two of the essays that you sent,
Okay.
and one of the things that was interesting to me was they were obviously on the same general subject material, but they were different. If I recall, one was on coyotes, and the other one
Right.
was on I don't remember the other one, what the other one was.
Probably water quality or something like that. I'm not
Yes,
sure which one
yeah,
you.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the water quality, and both of those are right. If you say, oh, I wrote one essay on coyotes, one on water quality, and be like, those are not the same. But so that was kind of interesting to me, and now having talked with you beforehand and in this conversation and kind
Right.
of how you're the generalist, that makes sense. Well, this is another area that you're kind of just exploring. So if you want to touch on how you got interested in it, and then we can go into your work and you're writing a book, and we can touch on that as well. So if you want to start with how you ended up interested in that subject.
Yeah, it's quite a difference. I realize that it's kind of a jarring change in a lot of ways. And part of it is, well, there's a couple things that matter here, I guess. Part of it is I'm middle-aged, right?
Hmm.
And so I got my PhD in all the stuff that we were just talking about, and I loved it. I was fascinated. That was my 20s and my 30s, and I wrote articles on it and did that kind of stuff. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East researching stuff and actually working on the Palestinian-Israeli peace process and things like that back in the 1990s. But I think like a lot of people, as you get older, I've always been someone who's interested in almost everything. Once I dive into it, in college, I think you were a geography major, right?
Yes.
Right. And I'm sure that you took other courses in other disciplines that you found interesting, right?
Yeah, look, I almost minored in math, and
Yeah,
then I
right. And I
decided
almost
that it got too hard.
Right. And I almost majored in my freshman year in classics, like
Hmm.
ancient Rome and Greece. I've always been fascinated by science. I've always been fascinated in almost anything. And I've always had, sometimes I kind of advise students that, every discipline is fascinating once you get into it, right?
Yes.
They all are fascinating once you get into it, even if they don't seem to. I mean, I've never had a class in accounting, but I guarantee you, when you really get into forensic accounting, It's probably pretty interesting, right? That
Yeah.
the dirty laundry of corporations and stuff like that. So part of it is just kind of a natural evolution of interest. The other part of the story is that I was raised here. I'm speaking in my office at Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I was raised just a few miles from here on a farm. We have a family farm, and I was raised in a very rural, in the 1970s, very rural kind of area. Now it's more built up and all that. So I always was very interested in nature and our relationship with nature. And I didn't go on and study it. I didn't major in biology or environmental science or anything like that. I've always been interested in it. So when I moved back here to take the job at Mary Washington, there was a local movement that was seeking to conserve a very valuable property, which is called Crow's Nest. Today it's called Crow's Nest Nature Preserve. It's in Stafford County. It's a
Hmm.
3,000 acre nature preserve. But back then it wasn't preserved. And that area has immense ecological diversity. It's one of the real gems of the Mid-Atlantic. It's I think like the largest blue heron nesting site and all that, and these kinds of things. And it abuts our family farm, and it's where I used to play when I was a kid. I used to go fishing
Oh.
there in the spring for the herring and the shad and all this kind of stuff. So when it was under a threat of development, I volunteered, got involved at a grassroots level to kind of help conserve the land, make the argument, and rabble rouse and stuff like that. And ultimately, that was successful. And I had a very small role in that. There were a lot of people who led that effort, far more important than I was. But ultimately, it was successful, and that kind of gave me a taste for doing that sort of work. And today, I am the chair of the board of directors of a nonprofit organization called the Northern Virginia Conservation Trust, which does this kind of work. We conserve land all around our area, over 8,000 acres so far, something like 9,000 acres we've conserved for habitat, for open space, for parks, for recreation, stuff like that. And so that's always been a part of me, but it's kind of come to the fore since I moved back to Fredericksburg. And being an academic, I like being active. I like being an activist, but I also like thinking through what I'm doing. And I realized that a lot of environmental activists know so much about environmental science, about biology, about ecology, but not necessarily social science, right? And so, like that organization, the Northern Virginia Conservation Trust that I work with, it has great legal expertise, it has great environmental expertise, but it doesn't necessarily have great social expertise. In other words, we work with many different communities, some in Fairfax, some in Annandale. Those are urbanized communities. Also in Caroline County and Spotsylvania, those can be very rural communities. And so we don't get our message out very well, and we're not necessarily being very efficient trying to conserve land if we don't understand the communities that we're working in. So I started studying that. I thought, okay, in my Middle East research, I've interviewed lots of people in Palestine and Egypt and Jordan, places like that. I'm going to interview people where I live and where I was raised. I was raised on a farm here, as I said. And so I know some farmers. I went to the Farm Bureau, talked to the farmers, and I started interviewing them about their land, how they thought about their land. Like, what attachment do they have to their land? Do they want to see it developed? Would they rather see some other, options, alternatives be pursued and things like that, with an eye towards informing local environmentalists about social knowledge here, not just environmental knowledge. An environmental scientist will tell you what acreage needs to be conserved in order to preserve or safeguard some species, but they can't necessarily tell you what the locals in that area think about that land, and are they going to support that effort or are they going to resist that effort? That was the kind of knowledge I was trying to bring to the table. So I got an article published on that kind of research. One thing led to another. And so you've read some of the articles I've been putting out in which I look at our relationship with nature, our relationship with each other. I've got a book proposal that's out right now. I talked to my literary agent earlier today about it. She's up in New York. And what I'm trying to do is use the farm that I was raised on in Stafford County, which has a creek running through it called Potomac Creek. If you live around here, you've driven over Potomac Creek 100 times.
Hmm.
I-95 and Route 1 go right over it.
Yep.
That's again where I used to play as a kid. And I'm using that as kind of a device to talk about more our relationship as individuals with nature, with the birds and the bees and the animals and all of this, the plants, but also, taking kind of a longitudinal perspective on things. The if you really think about the time that you spend occupying any one place, maybe where you were raised, Eric, or something like that, your presence there, your family's presence affected that place, right? I mean, you've left a mark, whether or not you're familiar with it or aware of it. But of course, we all leave. We're all gone over time, and every plant and animal and every human who's been on Potomac Creek has left some sort of a mark. And of course, we're all transient, right? So there are some species living on Potomac Creek now that were not there just 10 years ago. That's why I wrote an article about coyotes. Coyotes are really, really interesting. Coyotes are not indigenous to Virginia. They have
Hmm.
never,
Yeah.
to our knowledge, lived in Virginia before. They just arrived in our part of Virginia in the last 10 or so years. They're changing the ecology. They're you could call them an invasive species, right? And they're making a lot of people nervous. Some people want to shoot them all. Some people want to trap them all.
Oh, for sure. Like my in-laws, before they moved,
Yeah,
for retirement, they have two small dogs, and it got to the point where they didn't want to, even though the backyard was fenced, they
yeah,
didn't want to let them out anymore to go to the
right.
bathroom or whatever because they were like, "There's coyotes back there."
Yeah,
I was like,
yeah. No,
"Really there?"
absolutely.
But it's
A
a
lot of people,
small sort of park it's all
right.
wooded and it's not that big, but
Yeah.
they're still there.
And they've just shown up, and they've shown up because of humans, right? People who lived here before us who got rid of the big predators. I mean, there's no mountain lions around, there's no wolves around. So the coyotes are coming in and eating up fawns and eating up rabbits and squirrels and stuff like that because there's no bigger predator around anymore. So it's really because of humans that we have coyotes now. And we're all kind of grappling like, what do we do with them? And to me, the reality is once they're here, they're not going away, right?
No,
They have adapted to us.
not them especially.
Yeah, exactly. They have adapted to us, just like pigeons and things like that, and whatnot. And so over time, I'm sure we're going to become acclimated to them. I mean, we're going to learn how to have dogs and cats and coyotes, right? Same thing with different plants that most of us aren't even aware of. But I can look out my window any given day as I'm driving around in the car, and I can see all kinds of invasive species that were not here 50 years ago, 30 years ago, that are now dominating our landscape, right? And so I'm really interested in a number of things. I'm really interested in how we relate to these species as they come in and as some of them exit, because we're losing certain species just as quickly as we're adding, in some cases more quickly. But there's also a really intriguing parallel, and I have an article coming out later this year with a journal on this, between how we think about human immigrants and how we think about invasive species. It's almost like we go through
Mm,
certain stages, right? At first, we detest them. They're
yeah.
foreign. They're ugly. Their food is wrong. They don't speak our language. All these kind of, whether they're Irish or Hispanic or whatever, we're angry at them. We protest them. We probably beat up a few. We throw them in jail. We try to push them out. We try to build walls. We try to do all this stuff, right?
Hmm.
Over time, they become part of the landscape. And over time, we intermarry with them. And we're all eating Mexican, and now we celebrate, Cinco de Mayo. I'd never heard of Cinco de Mayo 15 years ago, right? And these kinds of and now half of my friends are drunk every Cinco de Mayo. They don't even know what Cinco de Mayo is, right?
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
barely.
People call it Cinco de Drinko.
Right, exactly, right.
Yeah.
These invasive species inevitably become part of the landscape,
Hmm.
but we spend billions of dollars trying to eradicate them prior to that. And the essay I have coming out in a Canadian journal called The Trumpeter, I actually detail how much money we're spending trying to eradicate, often very cruelly, to be honest, eradicate some of these invasive species. I mean, in the case of coyotes in the article that you read, we have cyanide bombs and things like that that we put out there. In some states, they're hunted by helicopter. I mean, it's a war, right?
Yeah.
And of course, it kills off, inadvertently, it kills off other species too, right? You plant bombs and stuff like that, and sometimes the wrong species hits it, bites into it or into the trap or something like that. So it can actually be quite bloody, the stuff that we do. And yeah, even spraying certain plants that are invasive grasses. There's a fascinating story that I detail in an upcoming article about a grass called Japanese stilt grass. You've seen it everywhere. You just maybe don't know what it is. It's everywhere. And that came here in the early part of the 20th century because we wanted relations with Japan in the 19th century. We forced open, Commodore Perry went to Japan,
Right.
1850s, I think it was.
I think 1848, right?
Yeah,
Something like
yeah,
that.
something like that. Yeah, I'm terrible at dates. If you haven't noticed, no, I write them down and I forget them. And that started a Japan craze. Everybody wanted Japanese ceramics and clothing and stuff like that. Well, we started sending crates and crates of Japanese and East Asians goods to the United States. And what did they? They had to get across the Pacific Ocean in wooden crates, so they packed them with grass. That was the noodle. Where are those foam noodles that we use?
Yeah.
The packing foam of the
Yeah.
19th century was this Japanese stilt grass. So now we have it here everywhere, right? And we spray it, with what's that spray we use on our driveways and all that?
Oh,
Roundup.
yeah.
Roundup. Studies show that 80% of us have Roundup in our urine right now.
Well,
We're,
that's
we're
not good.
yeah, that's not good, right? If it kills plants, maybe it doesn't kill us, but it can't be good for us, right? So we battle these things, we fight these things. You're never going to get rid of Japanese stilt grass. It's
No.
everywhere here. Every day I see it all over the place. That's kind of the dynamic that I'm really, really interested in right now in my current writing and my book project. How do we face these new incomers, whether they're plants and animals or whether they are human beings? And I come from an immigrant family that just over 50 years ago settled in a rural area and had to deal with these dynamics. You and I were talking before we started recording about Black Lives Matter and
Hmm.
racism and issues like that. We went through a fair amount of that, and now we're, to my knowledge, kind of accepted, after 50 years. And we have some funny names in the family, but people have kind of learned to pronounce them, and we're just part of the community. And there are really interesting kind of analogies and parallels between how we think about
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, 100%. That's a very specific niche that
Yeah,
you're in. The thing about Roundup is also quite interesting, and I don't know if your writing or work has taken you into this path, but when I'll say, so I'll tie it together in at the end. But when I look at food now that I'm eating, and I look at the ingredients list, and you hear, I think there was some fact is like the average human consumes like a credit card of microplastics a month or something crazy,
yeah,
whether it's from like water bottles like these or these various things. And it seems the unintended consequences of human actions. So you mentioned the Japanese grass, right? We use it as packing stuff, and now it's
right.
here, and maybe it creates problems for the native grass that's here. But we're not thinking about that. We just want some plate from Japan
Something
or
convenient.
whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
and Roundup is a similar thing. It's like we'd rather have this spray
Mhm.
or so I coach soccer, and one of my athletes had plantar fasciitis or a problem with his heel, so they got inserts. And I told the parents, I said, okay, the insert is okay for now, but you want to figure out what caused it in the first place rather than just put the solution. And so to tie it
Right,
back to the invasive species,
right.
instead of just putting cyanide bombs everywhere, have you gotten into that aspect of I imagine you have some from the grass, but
Yeah.
have you gotten into the aspect of how these species got here, if they're not even bad, right? Because sometimes invasive species just pop into the ecosystem and they change it a
Right.
little bit, but it's okay.
Right.
Where have you got,
Yeah.
have you done much writing on that or explored
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
of
I
that, and
do.
how things come into
Right.
the ecosystem, and then if what the effect is, and then what people are wanting to do about it, like
Right.
whether it's convenient or you shoot a coyote from a helicopter, it's like that doesn't
Yeah.
seem very productive in the long term.
Right.
Like, have you come across that sort of,
Yeah.
I'll say, I
Yeah.
don't even know what the right word is, but that subject, I guess.
Yeah, it's an area of interest, and it's also a debate, right? On what is the ultimate impact of invasive species? Are they all bad? Are they good, or something like that? Yeah, I have gone into it, and I have to always give the qualifier that I'm not an environmental scientist or a biologist or a chemist or anything like that. Really, in some ways, you can look at the work I'm doing as almost like journalism, right?
Hmm.
An educated person who has critical thinking skills and knows how to do some research, but who is looking as an outsider at a field and trying to look at the really, really big picture, right?
Hmm.
There are all these people with PhDs in the field who are looking at very narrow things, and I think kind of the value added of someone like myself, I hope, is that I look at the big picture and kind of scratch my head and say, hey, I see a pattern between our work on invasive species and how we treat human immigrants when they first come, right?
Yeah.
Which is
Can I
almost,
can I add one thing
yeah,
to how you're answering?
yeah,
The impact of the invasive species, and then how we deal with them as a matter of right? What is the shoe insert for an invasive species versus figuring out what the actual,
right. The
yeah,
original problem that we're
yeah.
trying to deal
And
with.
then if there's a maybe more a more natural way to
Absolutely.
integrate it.
This is right in the heart of what I'm writing about right now. And Eric, to really put it at the base level, what we're talking about, and this gets into philosophy
Hmm.
and religion and all this, is our relationship with the natural world. Um, our one of the big divides in philosophy is, do we see ourselves as a species, as humans, as a part of the natural world or not a part of the natural world, right? Are
Mm-hmm.
humans
Yeah.
separate from the natural world, or are we just one species among many in the natural world? And I swear to God, and I've written this down, Eric, you didn't take any classes with me, but I have found after 20 years of teaching undergraduate, by the end of a semester, like in a small class, a seminar, um, I can tell which students in the class hold which position, even if we're talking about
I
politics.
believe it.
It's the way they make arguments, right? Are they a part of something big and just an interdependent, codependent part of something big? Or are they somehow separate, objectively separate from the world that they're describing, right? And at some distance from it. And that is a real philosophical divide, and it's important to getting to the question that you're asking here in many ways, because traditionally in religion we have been taught, if you're a Christian or Jew or Muslim, I'm not an expert in all these religions, but you've been taught that humans are at the top of a hierarchy of existence, right? God gave us this world, Adam and Eve, gave us the world for us to use, to exploit, to enjoy, right? It's here for our pleasure. It feeds us, it clothes us, it houses us, and it is our role to steward this world, right? As the primary species, the one that is favored by God, created by God, and all this. So everything else is here for us, right? That's kind of the traditional religious viewpoint. And I have students who probably aren't that religious, but they reflect that in their discussions, right? You can hear it as
Yeah,
a
it's just how they're raised, and it's just around them,
right.
and they pick
But
it up.
even if
Yeah.
you're secular, even if you're not religious, there's a philosophy. It's the most pervasive secular philosophy in the West. It's called humanism, right? And this goes back to the Greeks and Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all of this. And this is the humanist philosophy takes as its basic principle that man is the measure of all things, right? We measure the world in terms of its value to us, right? So you don't even have to be religious, but how do we understand? When we study medicine, when we study physics, when we study chemistry, we are studying things that are of interest to us because we're interested in them, and we know cancer kills us. So we put billions of dollars of research into cancer because it harms us, right?
Hmm.
Or we're interested in things, and when we look at nature, when we look at a forest or the ocean, we think, what is its value to us? If we find it valuable, maybe we protect it. If we don't see it as valuable, or if we think mining that mountain is more valuable, we mine it, right? We are the measure of what is useful or not useful or something. That's the humanist philosophy, and again, it puts us at the top of the hierarchy. Now,
Can I add
go
something to
ahead.
that? I think what you're saying is super interesting because maybe 100 years ago or 200 years ago, humans were much more in a zero-sum game. It's like you either had food or you didn't. And now we are not really in that position anymore
Well,
in many
in some
ways. So
societies, right? In some
yeah,
societies,
in
and of course
some,
there are other traditions. That's why I keep saying kind of the Western tradition. So,
right.
because there are other, if you look at it, a lot of indigenous, say Native American beliefs that situate themselves completely within a world,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
They see spirits and trees and rocks and things, animist beliefs and stuff like that. So there are different traditions, and I'm not an expert in all these, but I say all this to point out that there are alternative ways of looking at our relationship with nature, and you, Eric, your personal relationship with nature and all of that, that are, you could say, more humble, more modest, that say that, in nature is all about interdependence, right?
Hmm.
It's not really about hierarchies. I think our orderly minds, we try to see hierarchies, patterns of hierarchies everywhere. We say that, oh, the lion is above the gazelle. Why? Because the lion eats the gazelle, right?
Yeah.
Gazelle is above the grass because the gazelle eats the grass or something. But when you really look at it objectively, and if you let go of a lot of baggage, there's no hierarchy there, right?
No.
We're imposing a hierarchy. I mean, ultimately, the grass eats all of them, right? And we as humans cannot live without plants, although plants can live without humans, right? We need their oxygen. And there are more gazelles than there ever will be lions, right? And all this. We're just kind of adding a hierarchy where there really isn't one. And of course, we always put ourselves at the very, very top of any hierarchy. But I would argue, and a lot of ecologists would argue, that more hierarchical philosophy, that more hierarchical perspective is very damaging in understanding all the questions that you asked me 5 or 10 minutes ago that I'm getting around to answering now. What is the good or bad of invasive species, for example? Um, Species, even without us, have always moved around the world. We are an invasive species, right? We came out of Africa, as far as anyone knows, right? And we invaded Europe and Asia and all this, and crossed land bridges into North America and stuff like
And
that.
then we invade each other.
Right. And we tend to, yeah, you're right. And we tend to think in the old way of thinking that we are managing things, right? You can get a degree in environmental science or studies or something and become a park manager. You can become a game manager. You can become, Secretary of the Interior in charge of managing the national parks or stuff like that. And really, if you look at it, I would argue objectively over the long term, from 80,000 feet, like we looked at the Middle East earlier, we're not managing anything. It's spinning out of control.
I agree.
More invasive species are coming in every day than we can ever hope to control. I mean, I gave you the one example of Japanese stilt grass that showed up inadvertently. Nobody said plant it here. It's everywhere now. Every day we're trying to eradicate more invasive species, and more are coming every day. Now we have the what is it? The spotted lantern moth. We have the ash borer. We have all of these things. Yeah, we never get rid of one. We have the snakehead. If you like fishing, I like fishing. Everybody was freaked out 20 years ago when the snakehead fish appeared in the Potomac. They said it's going to eat up all the bass, it's going to eat up all the shad. Now it's a huge game fish. They've stopped even trying to control it. The law says if you catch one, you have to kill it. They're everywhere here. They're everywhere here. Catfish, blue catfish, I think it is, were put here as a game fish in the 1960s and 1970s. They've taken over our rivers. even largemouth bass was planted here. It's not indigenous to our rivers. Now we think of it as native, but it was brought in, I think, in the 19th century as a game fish. That we're so out of control. You know, we didn't have any deer or beavers here 70, 80, 90 years ago. They were
Really?
indigenous. We shot them all or trapped them all, and then we had to bring them back. White-tailed deer were reintroduced here. Now we're all hitting them with our damn cars, right?
Yeah.
The beavers are flooding everything. They were wiped out. I mean, if that's management, where we make one species extinct, then have to bring it back, 2 generations later, and it's we're not really. If you were managing a corporation like that, you'd be fired, right?
Yeah.
But it's that conceit we have that we're actually managing nature. That if you kind of look at it from perhaps it's the outsider perspective that says we're not in control of any of this. We're one species among a lot, and we're a bright species, but we're not necessarily very good at self analysis, and it's really quite out of control, in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah, the deer example is a great, it's like,
Yeah,
yeah, we got rid of them all, but then we had to bring, it's like, it just,
yeah,
as you're saying, I was in South Africa about 5, 6 years ago,
wonderful.
and we were at Kruger National Park, and we were at a preserve in Swaziland, and
Yeah,
one of the, I'll say the wardens or the people that are running the park,
yeah,
for them, they've got a totally different issue to deal with, and that they've been turned into kind of pseudo militias because of the people that are poaching the ivory from the elephants and
right.
killing the rhinos and stuff. And so the conservation battle has taken so many different forms over the last I don't when did conservation really become a big thing? I don't know, 20,
Well,
30
yeah,
years ago, something
often
like
we
that.
think of late 19th century. Teddy Roosevelt was a
Yeah,
pioneer,
when he
national park
founded
system and stuff like that. Yeah,
yeah, and so it's taken on so many different forms that it's from somebody who doesn't pay attention to it that much. It's
right,
it's so hard to keep up with because every day there's a new something. It's like, okay, well, we got to save the elephants over here,
right.
and then there's only two of these things left at this zoo, and then there's one of those things left over there, and we've got to like somehow we got the DNA, so we're gonna make another one. Like all of the different like it seems very strange, and part of me thinks that we should just leave it alone,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I do see
yeah,
the value in there's people that want to do bad things, going back to the Africa example,
right.
and to see a species leave the planet by extinction when there's something that we could do to prevent that
Yeah,
seems both I'll say bad and good because so if the reason that they are becoming extinct is because of us, then that's not good. But also there's lots of natural reasons why species go extinct, and
yeah,
you don't want to save a species that's doomed for extinction because it didn't adapt or it's
yeah.
in the natural
Right,
selection
right.
sphere is down on the totem pole. And so obviously as a
Yeah.
total outsider, even more than you, it I think about these things sometimes and I often wonder like what are we doing? I can't tell.
But that's the key is you just asked the key question. What are we doing? I mean, the
Yeah.
article I have coming out later in this fall or something like that, that is basically the question I ask because I'm an outsider, right? I ask, what are we doing? Because from what I've read, we're spending billions of dollars doing all this stuff, trying to save this species over here, trying to kill off this species over there, trying to do this. We've lost 60% of birds in North America since 1970. I mean, we're obviously not managing things well. We're not even talking about climate change here and polar bears in the Arctic and all that. You're right. Often we pursue one individual species, like save this whale over here, save this seal over here, save this fish over here, take out that fish. Obviously the answer is just pursuing any one species, whether it's panda or something like that, is really kind of ridiculous. The point is you have to preserve the system that all the species depend on, And then it's an ecology, it's a bubble, right? That they're
Yeah.
all living in. You can't just save one species here and one species there. The whales need the fish and the krill and all that they live off of. They need clean air, clean water, like we all do, right? We're all dependent on the integrity of the whole bubble. But you're asking the right question, which is, what are we doing? And I'll give you one kind of last twist here, where I bring in a very different perspective to the study that I'm doing. For 6 years, I taught a graduate seminar for the Naval War College.
Oh.
Yeah. And it was a seminar based on the classical study of strategy. Why do we win or lose wars? Why does anyone win or lose wars? Napoleon, the American Revolution, the Greek wars of antiquity, World War II, World War I, the Iraq War, the War on Terror. We did all these case studies, and we thought about what are the classic mistakes that generals make, that presidents make, kings, emperors, all of this. How did they lose wars, and how did they win wars? And I take that framework that I taught for 6 years at the Naval War College and apply it to the war on invasive species. And if you
Mm.
take that learning, and this is a really weird thing to do, right?
I don't think so. I
Yeah,
like
right.
if you
Well, I
draw
don't think so
parallels, there's
either.
loads. Yeah.
Right. I don't think so either. So it's I found a peer review, journal that said, okay, we'll publish this. This is kind of weird. I take that learning and I say, look, this is what we know about warfare and the fundamental mistakes we make in warfare, right? That lead to bad outcomes. Let's look at what we're doing in the quote unquote war on invasive species in the United States. Well, one of the biggest mistakes, probably the biggest mistake you can make in warfare, is to go to war without a clearly defined goal, right?
Yep.
I mean, classic, right? Yeah, you don't even have to have a military background to figure out. I mean, try winning a football game without a clearly defined goal. Everybody knows how you win a football game. Whoever has the most points at the end of time wins the game. So you try to score points and keep them from winning, scoring points, right?
Yep.
In the war on terror, what was our goal?
Well, no one. Well, it was get Osama, and then after that, nobody really knew.
Nobody really knew, right? To summarize it, right? There was never a clear expression of the war on terror. And contrary to what a lot of people in the public today think, the war on terror is still going on full bore. We have troops all over in Africa and the Middle East, all this. Some of it you hear about, some of it you don't hear about. We just redeployed to Somalia, I think it was, and to other places. We have troops in Syria right now as we're talking about it. Salman Rushdie got stabbed again, and bombs are going. It's still going on, and it can flare up anytime. So what strategic thinkers in the Pentagon and all this will usually admit, not on camera maybe, is that one of the problems we've had with the war on terror from the beginning is we didn't know what the end state, the desired end state would look like, other than platitudes like no terrorism, right? What the hell does that mean, right? How much terrorism is no terrorism, right? And so we ended up in this very expensive, costly, protracted war without a clearly defined goal, right? Classic military mistake. Vietnam was that way too, by the way,
Yep.
in many ways, right? A lot of our more problematic wars have been like that. What is the war on invasive species? We're spending billions of dollars on it, thousands of people engaged in it, billions of dollars in research and extermination programs. They're all very good people, well-intentioned. I'm not questioning anyone's, intention or anything like that. What is the goal with invasive species? All that stuff we've just been talking about. More are arriving every day as we seek to exterminate ones, many of which we will never exterminate. And we know that if we actually speak honestly about it. Are we ever going to be willing to just say we're willing to live with invasive species? Because we're going to have to live with invasive species. Now, just like in warfare, there are corporate interests behind it. Monsanto or something, whoever makes Roundup is making a lot of money off of this, and stuff like that. So they're going to lobby for continued, operations and tactics and stuff like that. If you look at animals and plants, and if you value them, as I argue we should, we're killing a lot of them. We kill something like 50,000 coyotes a year.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many we, or actually more than that. It is, I mean, that's bloodshed. I mean, that's and it's just extraordinary that we have billions of dollars invested in these kinds of operations and all that, and nobody, to my knowledge, has articulated what the end state should look like. Like, what is the goal in all this? Because we're sure as hell not winning it, right? And it's a protracted war. It's been going on for generations now. We wipe one group out here. We're playing whack-a-mole, right? Which is exactly what people said was the problem with the war on terror. One group pops up, one terrorist group, Al Qaeda in Iraq pops up, you whack them. You get ISIS in Syria, you whack them. You get this group in Pakistan, you whack them. This group in the Philippines and Indonesia and Somalia and West Africa, Nigeria. We're whacking. What is the goal? Give me a clearly articulated goal, And I realize I don't mean to say it's easy to formulate clearly a goal in any of these things,
No,
but
of
until you
course.
recognize the problems, you can't even begin to come up with solutions, right? Until you honestly So I think that's one of the more interesting, I would say, articles I've been working on that I have coming out, is this analysis of the war on invasive species from a military perspective. I don't know what it's not out yet, so I don't know what the reaction will be. Maybe everybody will.
When is it supposed to
Sometime
come
this
out?
fall. It's in with the publisher right now. The journal is called, it's a long established Canadian journal. It's called The Trumpeter, the Journal of Ecosophy. Ecosophy is the wisdom that one gets from studying ecology or understanding ecology or something. So it's called The Trumpeter is the title of it, and it should come out sometime this fall. I'll make sure to send you a copy.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about it some other time.
Yeah, that would be great. We've been chatting for over an hour and a half already,
Yeah.
and I don't want to
Oh,
take up
okay.
too much
Yeah.
of your
Wow.
time. Um, Time flies. I could all of
Yeah.
these things I could talk about for forever. Do you have any last nickels before we get out of here for the
No, I
people?
don't. I don't. I would appreciate it if maybe I don't know how you post these things up or so, but if you want to pin my blog or something like that on
Yeah,
there,
yeah.
or something like that, if anyone's interested in this after hearing it. I know we've had kind of a schizophrenic discussion here,
They're
like
the best kinds.
yeah, 60 minutes of Middle East and then like 45 minutes of environmentalism and philosophy. And, I'm happy to talk about sports. I know you like sports and,
Yeah, yeah.
I like sports as well. And I'm interested, as I said, in just about everything that we could talk about. So some other day, maybe if we have
Yeah,
time.
100%. We should definitely do this again. For those listening, so what is your blog called? And I'll put it in the
Okay, the
description and
blog
everything, of
is
course. But
it's onthecreek.blogspot.com. With On the Creek, every word is separated by a hyphen. So I'll put it in, if you have a chat or a comment box or something like
yep,
that, I'll fill you in. And my Twitter handle is at 3lions99. And that's where it's all about nature. I don't do much politics or anything like
yeah,
that
yeah.
on that. But I'm working on a book project that's really, it'll become clear if you look at the blog and all that. So I
Sounds
appreciate
good.
the time, Eric.
Of course, of course. For those listening, we will see you guys next time.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eric.
Of course.